Take your filthy hands off my car, old man. Don't you see what you just did? You've ruined my paint with your measly vegetables. Do you think money grows on trees to pay for this kind of luxury? Don't you dare touch my car. Just back off and learn to watch where you're walking. Are you already blind at your age, or are you just a nuisance who's useless? Get out of my sight. I don't have time to waste on you. The morning sun broke over the mountains of Puebla, painting the hunched back of the man, a melancholic ochre. Don Esteban Ramirez, she carried 70 years on her shoulders, each one weighing like the stones she'd removed from her land so she could sow some dignity. Her wicker basket, woven with her own hands when it still had the strength of an oak, creaked under the modest weight of a harvest that was her only living currency. The pain in her knees was a constant companion, a dull echo of the promise she'd made to herself. She would keep walking, keep selling, until she found peace. The hot asphalt felt like a mockery beneath his worn sandals. Don Esteban, with his faded cotton shirt and face weathered like ancient parchment, advanced with a resigned but not defeated slowness. It wasn't just the need to carry medicine that drove him on. It was a wild hope, rooted deep in her chest. That hope had a name, a child's face blurred by smoke and time, that of her son lost in the fire 3 decades earlier. The cars passed like in different gusts, each leading lives that seemed to him to be from another galaxy. Don Esteban only saw the street, looking for a corner to set up his stand, a quiet place where the sun wouldn't burn his skin more than necessary. His eyes, although tired, held a spark, the inextinguishable fire of a father who refuses to close a cycle without knowing the truth. The silver bracelet he wore on his wrist was assolent testimony, a reliquary of a past that refused to become ash. If there's one thing Alejandro Torres hates, it's interruptions. The horn pierced the air like a metallic scream, and the squeal of the brakes of his gleaming black luxury car shattered the morning silence. Since landing from Los Angeles, he'd experienced one frustration after another. Businesses were slow, people were inefficient, and traffic was a third-world nightmare. Now, an old man with a basket had cut him off downtown, forcing him to an abrupt stop. The impact was light, but sufficient. Don Esteban's basket flew through the air, and onions, chili peppers, and tomatoes rolled onto the pavement like broken rosary beads. A ripe tomato exploded against the vehicle's sleek black fender, leaving a red stain that infuriated the young businessman. His impeccable Armani suit felt suffocating, and the adrenaline of anger rushed to his head. He slammed the door of the car, his commanding voice, accustomed to corporate environments, echoing in the street. Alexander, slender, wearing sunglasses that hid his irritation, began to shout. He accused the old man of negligence, of ruining an expensive property, of being a hindrance. The words were sharp darts, born of years of greed and easy success in the culture of self-made man American. Don Esteban, stunned by the fall and the crash, could only tremble and mumble an apology, his bony hands trying in vain to clean up the mess. Humiliation rose to his face, but as the young man scolded, his voice trailed off. Something in the old man's face, a depth of sadness and resignation that transcended simple shame, disarmed him. It was a look he'd seen too much of, a lifetime of struggle reflected in the furrows of his skin. It was a father's sadness, though Alejandro didn't know it. The businessman, accustomed to domination, felt a pang, an inexplicable sting of guilt he'd never experienced in his life as a successful adult. As Alejandro reluctantly helped pick up the remains of the broken basket and the mixture of soil and produce, one tiny detail became a magnet. On the peasant's wrist, peeking out from the sleeve of his threadbare shirt, was a silver bracelet, old, dark from oxidation and constant use. It wasn't a jewel, but a handcrafted piece, irregular, with crude but lovingly executed engravings. Alejandro's gaze fixed on it, feeling a subconscious connection. Don Esteban, for his part, looked up, and his eyes fell on Alejandro's right hand, which was holding a bruised onion. Right where the index finger meets the palm, There was a small, whitish scar, with a peculiar shape, like a small star. It was an instant reflection, an image seared into his memory. His voice came out in a harsh whisper, barely audible over the noise of the traffic returning to normal. My son had one just like it. He got it with a nail, playing near the hearth, Don Esteban murmured, more to himself than to the young man. The air thickened between them. Alejandro froze, feeling a chill run down his spine, as if the ground had opened up beneath his feet. He didn't understand the reaction, but it was a shaken in his soul, which brought him out of his arrogance and forced him to feel. The young businessman couldn't help but reach into his pocket. Inside the lining of his jacket, in a velvet pouch, he kept an object that had been with him since his childhood in the Los Angeles orphanage. It was a bracelet, identical, forged in silver, with the same irregular engravings. He had never known its origin, only that it was the only thing he had from his previous life. He had assumed it was a gift from a relative who hadn't wanted it. Night fell like a heavy curtain on Alejandro's modern hotel, but the luxury and comfort of his suite could not silence the storm that had broken out in his mind. The image of that old man, the scar on his own hand that he had never questioned before, and the memory of the identical bracelet formed a wall of questions that kept him from sleeping. The guilt in the morning had turned into an obsessive need to know. He got out of bed, turned on the laptop, and began a desperate search. He typed into the search engine, San Miguel del Rio fire, 1994. A small fragment of a decades-old local press release appeared on the screen, yellowed and poorly digitized. It read, Ramirez family loses home and son in tragic fire. The headline was simple, but the description was a direct blow to her heart. The missing son, a 5-year-old boy. Alejandro read and reread the text, feeling like each word was a piece of a puzzle he didn't know he was putting together. He vaguely remembered the smell of smoke, the chaos, the fear before being taken in by social workers. He had always believed his parents had abandoned him, that he had been just another orphan with no history. Now, the possibility of a past erased by flames, and not because of abandonment did it hang over him with an unprecedented force. Her heart pounded against her ribs with an unknown fury. It was the fear and excitement of a monumental discovery. If the bracelet wasn't a coincidence, if the old man was who her instincts screamed he was, then her entire life, her success, her arrogance, her identity, was a lie built on absence. She stared at her trembling hands. The fire of 1994, the one she'd assumed was forever forgotten in the shadows of her childhood, seemed to have burned again with brutal intensity. The next morning, Alejandro didn't go to his business meeting. He put on jeans and a simple shirt, leaving his suit of arrogance hanging in the closet. He drove his luxury car back to the market, searching among the humble stalls and crowd for the old man who had stolen his peace. It wasn't a search, but a pilgrimage toward a truth he feared and longed for in equal measure. Finally, he saw it, Don Esteban under a worn awning, selling his wares. He approached without the noise or haste of the previous day, with a humility he had never seen before. "Sir," he said in a hoarse voice, "I need to know something. Where did you get that bracelet?" Don Esteban raised his gaze, reflecting a mixture of distrust and the same infinite sadness. He had recognized the young man from the recriminations, but now the arrogance had been replaced by an urgency that moved him. He seemed like a child asking for an explanation. The old man, taking a deep breath, took a moment before answering. "It was my son's. My only son. I made it with my own hands, with the metal from an old bell that melted down. I engraved it for him before the fire took him from me." The tone was of a deep confession, an open wound that refused to close. Her wrinkled fingers caressed the dark metal, a gesture of a love that had resisted oblivion. Alejandro said nothing more. Slowly, he took the handkerchief wrapped around his own bracelet from his pocket. He unwrapped it, revealing the identical metal, the same rustic design. They both shivered as they brought the two pieces together, comparing the engravings, barely visible initials, E.R. Esteban Ramirez, and a blurred date. At that moment, words were unnecessary. Fate, in its cruel and perfect synchronicity, had used a piece of silver to unite two separated souls. "We need proof, sir. We need to be sure, for your peace and mine," Alejandro said, his voice firm despite the emotion clouding his judgment. Don Esteban hesitated, a peasant's deep-rooted distrust of modernity. But the young man's gaze, that mixture of his own sadness and the urgent need to know, convinced him. The hope he had kept alive for 30 years now presented itself before him in a luxury car. They arrived at a modest clinic on the outskirts of the city, a clean and discreet place. As they waited in the waiting room, a silence filled with history settled between them. Alejandro, the successful businessman, felt stripped of his titles, reduced to a child waiting for an identity. Don Esteban, the humble old man, felt for the first time in years a father with a purpose. They sat together on a hard bench, side by side, feeling the strange familiarity that arose. They began to share fragments of their lives, as if they were loose threads that fate was hastily weaving together. Alejandro spoke of his orphaned childhood in Los Angeles, of the cold of foster homes, of the ambition that led him to success as a way to fill the void. Don Esteban, for his part, told him about his solitary life in Puebla, his farming, and the memory of little Mateo, his son, playing in the yard. The stories were different, but the hunger for affection, it was the same in both. The bond grew with each unspoken word. Don Esteban taught Alejandro how to pronounce his hometown's name with the correct accent. Alejandro showed him photos of Los Angeles on his cell phone. The world the old man had only imagined. Hours turned into minutes, and fear dissolved into an unexpected tenderness. The young man felt grounded for the first time. The old man accompanied. Blood no longer mattered. The day of the results arrived in a dense fog, reflecting the mood in the small waiting room. They were both silent, their hands close but not touching, each fighting an internal battle. The nurse entered, called their names, and handed the envelope to the doctor, who opened it with unnecessary formality that only increased the tension. Don Esteban looked at the young man, and Alejandro returned a look of support he didn't feel. The doctor was direct, without technical embellishments. "I'm sorry, gentlemen. The results of the DNA test are conclusive. There is no genetic match." The sentence fell like a hammer on glass, shattering the fragile hope they had built. Don Esteban remained silent, his face petrified into a mask of desolation, a wrinkled canvas where disappointment was etched in permanent ink. It was as if the fire of 30 years ago had once again consumed everything. Alejandro felt a devastating emptiness. An abyss opened beneath his feet. He had allowed himself to dream of an origin, of a home. Now he was once again the rootless orphan. "So, I am not your son," he murmured, his voice barely a wounded whisper. Tears gathered in the old man's eyes, not only because of the truth, but because of the sudden disappearance of light who had come into her life with this young man. The pain of losing him was immediate. Don Esteban took Alejandro's face in his hands, looking at him with an intensity that pierced sadness. "No, you're not. My Mateo isn't in your blood," he said, tears streaming down his cheeks. He paused for a long time, filled with an emotion the young man would never forget. "But since you arrived, son, my heart started beating again. It doesn't matter what this paper says. You are my hope, my gift." Despite the result, or perhaps because of it, Alejandro decided to stay in Puebla. The return ticket to Los Angeles was forgotten in his wallet. The big corporate life, the frenetic pace, everything now seemed artificial and empty compared to the deep simplicity that he had found with Don Esteban. He had discovered a hunger in his soul that millions could not satisfy, a hunger for belonging. She bought the medicines the old man couldn't afford, fixed the broken tiled roof that was threatening to collapse, and in the evenings she cooked with him, learning ancient recipes and flavors he'd never encountered in fancy restaurants. The two established a routine, a harmonious rhythm that healed invisible wounds. The house, once silent and full of ghosts, was filled with the sound of laughter and the scent of life. Don Esteban taught Alejandro to care for the land, to feel the moisture in the soil, to recognize the promise of a seed. The young businessman, with his hands previously only accustomed to keyboards and contracts, learned the nobility of physical effort, the value of what grows slowly. At night, Alejandro read him stories about big cities, technology, and travel, opening a window to a world the old man never had the chance to see. The bond that united them grew stronger than genetics, a pact of souls. One afternoon, as they watched the sun set over the fields, Don Esteban leaned on Alejandro's shoulder. "I don't know if I came to help you pay my debts, or if you came to save me from the loneliness that was slowly killing me," the old man murmured, with a peace he'd never seen before in his voice. Alejandro smiled, feeling that finally, in that dusty field, had found his true home. The calm was short-lived. Despite the comfort and love he had found, a thorn remained stuck in Alejandro's heart. The truth. If he wasn't Don Esteban's son, who was he? Justice for the old man lay in finding his real son. Driven by this new mission, Alejandro returned to the only lead he had, the orphanage in Atlixco, the institution where he himself had been delivered after his rescue. This time, it was not as an orphan searching for his origin, but as a private investigator with a noble motive. An old employee, his memory filled with forgotten faces, greeted him cautiously. After days of insistence and showing him the identical bracelet, the employee relented and agreed to review the dusty, forgotten files from the time of the fire. The paperwork from 1994 was chaotic and sparse, but it was there. The clerk found an old typewritten card. "Child without documents, found after a fire, silver bracelet." Alejandro's heart leaped. That was his card. But next to it was a handwritten note, almost illegible from the dampness. It read, "Second child surrendered. Emilio Vargas." The employee confirmed that social services had confused the children, or due to the urgency, had mixed up their identities. Alejandro stared at the note, his blood pounding in his temples. The fire had not only destroyed a house, but it had created a smokescreen in the identity of two children. He took a quick photo of the registry and ran back to Puebla. The truth was more complicated, more painful. But now it was one step away from being revealed. Don Esteban's story was incomplete, and the fate of his real son, Mateo, remained up in the air. Alejandro returned home with urgency etched on his face. He sat down with Don Esteban and, holding the tablet, showed him the photo from the orphanage registry. The old man, his eyes tired, read the name. The old orphanage employee, under pressure from Alejandro, had revealed a crucial piece of truth. After the fire, confusion was complete. Two children were found near the disaster area and taken to Atlixco. One was adopted quickly, a child identified only by a bracelet and his initials, who ended up with a family in the capital. The other, Alejandro continued, pointing to his own file, was me, picked up later, without documents, with the same bracelet, but labeled as no identity. Reality set in with a mathematical cruelty. The fire not only separated, but also exchanged, or at least confused, two destinies completely. Don Esteban listened in silence, his mind processing the magnitude of the tragedy. The possibility that his Mateo had been adopted under another name, that he had grown up in another home, was both a relief and a new torment. The two identical bracelets, made by the same father, were meant for two children, but the confusion of the fire had led them into two parallel lives. The truth was a labyrinth of pain. Hope was renewed, but with a new burden of guilt. Alejandro felt like an imposter, someone who had taken the place of the real son in the old man's affections, albeit unintentionally. Don Esteban, however, looked at him fondly. The fire didn't just destroy a home, son. He also mixed two destinations. But now you are the key that will open them again, she said, taking Alejandro's hand with surprising strength. The search for the past came to an abrupt halt. The heart of Don Esteban, worn out by 70 years of hard work, grief, and the recent onslaught of emotions, he began to fail. His cough deepened, his steps slowed. The joy Alexander had brought was overshadowed by the reality of his illness. The young man took him to the best doctors he could find in the city, spending his money without a second thought. The diagnosis was clear and cruel. The old man's heart was tired, and his body no longer responded to medicine. There was no cure, only palliative care. Alejandro refused to accept it, but Don Esteban looked at him with the wisdom of someone who accepts his fate. Don't worry, son. I've already lived my life, and it doesn't hurt to die. It hurts me not knowing if my Mateo is still alive. I won't go in peace without that answer, the old man whispered. Alejandro sat beside his bed, his eyes filled with a desperation he hadn't felt since his childhood. The Los Angeles businessman had reverted to the child who couldn't save the one he loved. He took the old man's hand, feeling the fragility of his pulse. Time was running out like fine sand between his fingers, and the urgency of finding Emilio Vargas, the code name, became a matter of life or death. I promise you, Dad, Alejandro said, using the word for the first time with conviction. I will find him. I will search for him among the ashes of this story. I will bring him back to you so you can see him one last time. Don Esteban smiled at him with tears in his eyes, and for a moment, peace returned to the room. The young man stood up with renewed determination. There was no time for mourning, only for frenetic action of an adopted child who was fighting for a father. Alejandro immersed himself in an obsessive investigation. He used all his contacts and resources in the United States to track down the name, Emilio Vargas, searching adoption databases and public records. The search was slow and frustrating, but she didn't give up. Don Esteban's face, so weak in bed, was her driving force. She couldn't fail her adoptive father in this last wish. Finally, after days of tireless work, the information appeared. Emilio Vargas, 35, a civil engineer from Querétaro, adopted at age 5 by a family from the capital who had moved to Bajío. Alejandro felt an electric shock. It was him. Cautiously, and with a mixture of fear and excitement, he contacted him. He introduced himself, explained the story of the fire, the identical bracelet, the confusion at the orphanage, and Don Esteban's terminal illness. He told him everything without omitting the intensity of the drama. Emilio, on the other end of the line, listened in stunned silence. His life was orderly and logical. Alejandro's story was a whirlwind of drama and soap opera. But the bracelet, the same silver piece he kept in his safe as an inexplicable memento, made him doubt. Destiny had an outstanding debt, and Alejandro had come to collect it. After hours of conversation, the truth prevailed over disbelief. The young engineer, moved by the urgency of the story and the nobility of the young man he himself thought was his son, agreed. He couldn't deny a dying old man the chance to see his biological son. I'm going there. Tomorrow morning I'll be in Puebla, Emilio said. Alejandro hung up, feeling overwhelming relief. The fire that separated them with so much pain and confusion, now he was about to unite them in a last and precious encounter. The sound of a car pulling up in front of Don Esteban's country house the next morning woke the old man. Alejandro was already at the door, waiting. The man who got out of the car was tall, with a serious expression, but his eyes held a warmth reminiscent of Don Esteban's tenderness. They greeted each other with a handshake, an awkward mix of strangers and brothers by fate. They entered the humble house together. Don Esteban was lying back, his face pale, but his eyes shone with an almost painful expectation. When Emilio Vargas, the engineer, came in and stood beside the bed, the old man looked at him. There was no need for words or proof or elaborate explanations. It was a deep, ancestral connection, which transcended the 30-year absence. Don Esteban saw his 5-year-old son in the eyes of the adult standing before him. "Mateo!" Don Esteban shouted, the name coming out with a force he hadn't felt in a long time, accompanied by tears that flowed uncontrollably. "It's you, my Mateo, the son the fire took from me." The young engineer, who had come with doubts, felt an emotional impact that made him fall to his knees beside the bed. The old man's tears were the only proof he needed. Emilio Vargas, now Mateo Ramirez, hugged his biological father with a strength that contained 3 decades of emptiness. The embrace was an explosion of tenderness and catharsis, an end to the hell of the fire. Alejandro watched the scene from the doorway, his own tears streaming down his face. It wasn't his place, but his heart felt inexplicably full. Finally, the fire found its end in an embrace unbreakable filial love. Night fell with unusual serenity. The air smelled of wet earth and peace. Don Esteban, lying in his bed, held the hands of his 2 sons, his biological son and his soul son. He told them stories of Mateo's childhood, of how he loved to run through the cornfields and how he played with the bracelet his father had made for him. Mateo listened to every word, filling the emptiness of a borrowed life. Alejandro, silently, felt that his mission was complete. The old man smiled weakly, his eyes tired but filled with a new light. He knew his time had come. There was no more loneliness, no more uncertainty, no more the weight of an endless search. He was surrounded by love, with his children together, one looking out for the other. He asked them to take care of each other, to never let go, that love was the only real thing in this world worth the effort. His words were a last testament of affection. As dawn approached, the crowing of the roosters joined the silence of the room. Don Esteban fell asleep, his breathing becoming slower, lighter, until it stopped. His face held a smile, an expression of absolute peace. He left without pain, without regrets, with the only certainty that had mattered to him in life. His son was safe, and in his place, he had gained another. The cycle had come full circle. Alejandro and Mateo looked at each other without needing words. The pain was immense, but it was wrapped in deep gratitude. They had arrived on time. They had kept their promise. The old man he left with his heart full, with the love of 2 children who had found him in the end, and who were now the family he had dreamed of. Don Esteban's legacy was not the land, but the unconditional love he had sown in 2 souls. Weeks later, the pain had turned into a mission. Alejandro had sold his luxury car and rented a small space in the market where Don Esteban used to sell. He called him Don Esteban's Corner, and transformed it into a food stand where he and Mateo, on their free weekends, prepared and gave away hot meals to needy seniors in the Puebla market. It was a legacy of service, a tribute to his father's humility. On the main wall of the small stand, Alejandro hung a picture, an old faded photo of Don Esteban's cornfield, and just below it, the 2 silver bracelets, now clean and shiny, joined by a chain. One represented blood, the other, the soul. They were the symbol of a story that had overcome fire and time to teach, that family is built from the heart, not just genetics. Mateo, the engineer, had stayed nearby. Alejandro returned to Los Angeles, but not to the corporate life he had left. He founded the Esteban Ramirez Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping homeless elderly people and finding missing children. Her ambition had been refocused, channeled toward service, honoring the emotional awakening she'd experienced during that humiliating encounter with a farmer. Her arrogance had vanished. As the sun set over the Pacific, Alejandro stood on his terrace, touching his father's small bracelet from the Puebla stand. He whispered to the wind, a peaceful smile lighting his face. Thank you, Dad. The fire separated us, but your love united us forever. If this story touched you and reminded you of the unbreakable power of human connection, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Don't miss the next story that touches your soul. Always remember, life can take everything from you, even your very identity, but it can never steal your ability to give love. Finding your purpose is finding your home. Don't let the ashes of the past extinguish the fire of your hope.